In recording studios across America in 1978, the pattern was always the same. Young artists would arrive with dreams, and seasoned producers would shape those dreams into something marketable, something safe. The artist would play, the producer would decide, and the machine would turn. This was how stars were made. This was how the industry worked. This was the unbreakable rule. Except on one particular morning in Burbank, California, that rule was about to shatter. Prince had traveled from Minneapolis with a single suitcase and a demo tape that Warner Brothers executives couldn't stop playing. They'd heard thousands of demo tapes. This one was different. Not because of the songs, though the songs were extraordinary. Not because of the voice, though the voice defied classification. It was different because every instrument, every note, every layer of sound had been performed by the same person. The teenager now sitting in their office had done alone what most artists needed a full band to accomplish. Warner Brothers was prepared to make him rich. They were prepared to make him famous. What they weren't prepared for was the possibility that this quiet kid with a soft voice might look at their $3 million offer and see it as incomplete. That he might want something no 19-year-old had ever demanded. That he might be willing to walk away from millions if he didn't get it. If you want to discover more untold stories from music history, subscribe now and join thousands who never miss these revelations. Warner Brothers had heard Prince's demo through a Minneapolis businessman and immediately understood they were listening to something unprecedented. Within weeks, Prince was sitting in a Burbank conference room across from Lenny Waronker and Russ Thyrett, two of the most powerful executives in the music industry. They'd done their homework on this 19-year-old prodigy. They knew about his basement recordings, knew about the 17 fully produced songs he'd created alone, knew that other labels were circling. What they were about to offer represented one of the largest contracts Warner Brothers had ever extended to an unknown artist. $3 million over 3 albums. It was astronomical. It was generous. And they were certain it would be accepted immediately. The conference room felt enormous. Waronker and Thyrett sat with the confidence of men who'd shaped the careers of legends, who built one of the most successful labels in the industry through careful artist development and proven production strategies. Prince sat across from them, quiet and composed, wearing platform shoes that added inches to his small frame. His expression revealed nothing. He'd been preparing for this moment his entire life, teaching himself not just music, but the technical skills of production, learning mixing boards and microphone placement, with the same obsessive focus he'd applied to mastering 27 different instruments. In 1978, the music industry operated on one fundamental principle. Labels controlled production. An artist would sign a contract, and the label would assign experienced producers, session musicians, arrangers, and engineers. The artist's job was to perform, to bring talent and charisma. Everything else, every decision about how a song would sound, what instruments would be used, how the final mix would be balanced, belonged to professionals with decades of experience. This wasn't cruelty or manipulation. This was business. Labels invested millions in artists, and they protected those investments by ensuring that people who understood commercial radio formats and market demographics controlled the creative process. Warner Brothers had refined this system to near perfection over the years. They'd launched careers, created superstars, produced albums that defined entire generations. The formula worked, and they saw no reason Prince should be any exception. Yes, he was talented. Yes, he could play multiple instruments. Yes, he'd produced his own demo. But demo tapes and actual albums were completely different endeavors. Albums required studios that cost thousands of dollars per day, required mixing boards that took years to master, required an understanding of what radio programmers would actually play. Waronker slid the contract across the table. The document was thick, filled with standard industry language about recording schedules and marketing obligations and tour support. Buried in the middle sections were the clauses about creative control. Warner Brothers would provide producers. Warner Brothers would approve final mixes. Warner Brothers would decide which songs made the album and which didn't. This was standard. This was how every major label contract looked. This was the unbreakable framework that had built the entire industry. Prince read slowly, his finger moving down the pages. Waronker and Thirret exchanged satisfied glances, already mentally planning the production team they'd assign, already imagining which of their veteran producers would best complement Prince's raw talent. The champagne was, metaphorically speaking, already on ice. And then Prince looked up from page 7 and spoke so quietly that Waronker had to lean forward to hear him. "I need to produce myself," Prince said. The room didn't explode. There was no shouting, no dramatic rejection. Instead, there was something worse. Confused silence. Waronker and Thirret exchanged glances, both men trying to determine if they'd misheard. If this teenager had actually just demanded something that no major label had ever granted to an unproven artist. The pause stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Waronker spoke, his voice careful, measured. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" Prince's voice remained soft, but his words were absolutely clear. "I need full creative control. I produce the album, I play the instruments, I make the decisions. Or there's no deal." The logic, from Warner's perspective, Astar, was insane. They were offering $3 million to someone who'd never sold a single record, never worked in a professional studio, never navigated the complex technical and commercial requirements of creating a major label release. They were taking an enormous financial risk on potential, on talent, on the possibility that this demo tape represented something that could translate into commercial success. And now, instead of gratitude, instead of the immediate acceptance they'd anticipated, they were being presented with an ultimatum that seemed to come from a place of either breathtaking arrogance or complete naivety. Thirret tried reason first, his tone patient, almost fatherly. "Prince, we understand you're talented. That's obviously why we're here. But producing an album is incredibly complex. There are technical aspects, mixing and mastering processes that take years to learn. We have producers who've worked on dozens of platinum records. They can help you achieve your vision while ensuring the final product meets the standards that radio stations and record stores expect." His words were designed to be helpful, to guide this kid toward understanding the gap between basement recordings and professional releases. Waronker leaned back in his chair, studying this teenager who seemed completely unaware of how negotiations were supposed to work, who appeared immune to the normal pressures that made artists grateful for whatever opportunities came their way. "Have you ever worked in a professional recording studio?" he asked. "Do you understand how multi-track boards operate? How many hours of studio time an album typically requires? The technical expertise involved in creating something that can compete with established artists?" The questions weren't meant to be hostile. They were meant to illustrate reality, to help Prince recognize the enormous distance between his basement setup and the professional production standards that Warner Brothers maintained. Instead of backing down, Prince reached into his bag and pulled out documentation he'd prepared. Technical specifications for recording equipment, detailed notes on microphone placement and signal flow, breakdowns of how each song on his demo had been layered and mixed, using equipment he'd borrowed, rented, or built himself. He taught himself not just how to play instruments, but how to engineer recordings, studying mixing boards and studio techniques with the same completeness he'd applied to music theory. For the next 20 minutes, Prince walked the executives through his process, explaining how specific sounds had been achieved, demonstrating an understanding of recording technology that contradicted everything about his age and experience. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't arrogant. He simply presented information with the calm certainty of someone who'd already spent years preparing for this exact conversation. And slowly, impossibly, Waronker and Thirret began to realize that their assumptions might be wrong. But recognizing technical competence and granting unprecedented creative control were entirely different decisions. Warner Brothers had shareholders, had a board of directors, had decades of institutional wisdom that said letting a 19-year-old produce his own major label debut was financial suicide. If Prince failed, if the album flopped despite their $3 million investment, the label wouldn't just lose money. They'd become an industry laughingstock. The cautionary tale about what happens when you let inexperienced kids dictate terms to experienced professionals. Waronker excused himself and Thirret for a private discussion. Prince and his manager, Owen Husney, waited in the conference room, silence stretching between them. Husney desperately wanted to speak, wanted to suggest compromise, wanted to explain that you don't walk away from $3 million over production credits. But something in Prince's expression stopped him. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about a teenager throwing a tantrum or making unreasonable demands to feel important. This was about survival. Prince knew with absolute certainty that if someone else produced his music, it wouldn't be his music anymore. It would be a version of his music filtered through someone else's understanding, someone else's vision, someone else's idea of what would work commercially. And that version would fail. Not because it was bad, but because it would be incomplete, compromised, a shadow of what it should be. Hosny had heard plenty of artists talk about creative vision, about integrity, about not selling out. Usually, that talk disappeared the moment a real money appeared on the table. But watching Prince sit motionless in that conference room, his face calm, his hands still, Husney understood that this kid meant every word. Prince would actually walk away. He'd go back to Minneapolis, back to basement studios and borrowed equipment, back to nothing, rather than sign a contract that gave someone else control over his sound. 30 minutes later, Waronker and Thirret returned. Their faces revealed nothing as they took their seats. The silence felt heavy, final. Then Waronker picked up a pen and looked directly at Prince. "We've never done this before," he said slowly. "We have serious reservations about what you're asking. But we've listened to your demo about 40 times now, and we keep hearing something we can't quite explain. So we're willing to make an exception." The conditions came quickly, presented as necessary protective measures. Warner would provide a substantial recording budget, but maintain oversight on spending. They'd assign an experienced engineer to work with Prince in the studio, not to control the process, but to ensure technical quality and help navigate the professional equipment. Most critically, Warner retained the right to intervene if the project went catastrophically wrong, if deadlines were missed by months, if the material simply wasn't commercially viable by any reasonable standard. Prince listened to each condition without interruption, his expression neutral. When Waronker finished, there was a pause. Then Prince spoke. "Okay, but when the album is finished, you'll see that none of those safety nets were necessary." They shook hands. The contract was modified with handwritten notes in the margins, annotations that would be formalized later by lawyers, but that represented, in that moment, an unprecedented shift in how a major label was willing to work with an artist. Prince Rogers Nelson, at 19 years old, had just become the youngest artist in Warner Brothers history to receive full production control on a major label debut. Prince returned to Minneapolis carrying a contract that would have made most teenagers ecstatic. Instead, he felt the weight of what he'd promised. Warner Brothers was providing access to the record plant in Sausalito, one of the most advanced recording facilities in the world. The studio costs were astronomical. Every hour Prince spent recording was an hour Warner Brothers was calculating against their $3 million investment. If he failed, if he couldn't deliver on his promise, the industry would remember. and he'd never get another chance. The recording sessions began in September 1978. Tommy Vicari, the engineer Warner had assigned, arrived expecting to guide an inexperienced kid through the basics of professional recording. What he encountered instead was something he'd never seen in 2 decades of studio work. Prince arrived each evening at 7 with handwritten charts for every song, every arrangement mapped out in meticulous detail. And then he simply began recording. Not tentatively, not experimentally, but with the precision of someone who'd already completed the album 100 times in his imagination and was now just capturing what already existed. He'd record the bass line for an entire song in one take, then immediately move to drums, then keyboards, building each track with a speed that seemed impossible. There were no wasted takes, no searching for sounds, no lengthy discussions about what might work. Prince knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to achieve it. Vicari watched him operate the mixing board, adjust microphone placements, make decisions about reverb and compression without hesitation. This wasn't a talented amateur learning as he went. This was someone who'd already mastered the technical aspects of production through years of solitary study. But technical skill alone wouldn't justify Warner's risk. What made the sessions remarkable was the music itself. Prince was creating something that didn't fit into existing categories, blending funk and rock and pop and R&B in ways that felt both futuristic and deeply rooted in musical tradition. His voice shifted between falsetto and baritone, sometimes within the same phrase. The lyrics were explicit, exploring sexuality with a directness that Vicari knew would challenge radio programmers. And underlying everything was a perfectionism that bordered on obsession. Prince would record the same guitar part 20 times, making adjustments so subtle that Vicari couldn't hear the difference, searching for something that existed only in his mind. Warner Brothers executives began visiting the studio, initially to monitor their investment, but increasingly because they were witnessing something unprecedented. The kid they'd reluctantly granted production control was working at a level that most veteran producers never achieved. As the album progressed, Prince played 27 different instruments, not as a gimmick, but because that's what the songs required. Each instrument was rendered with professional precision, each part fitting into arrangements that were complex without being cluttered, sophisticated without being inaccessible. The final track, a song called I'm Yours, showcased everything that made Prince unique. The arrangement layered multiple vocal harmonies over a shifting rhythm, the production crisp and balanced with a precision that demonstrated complete mastery of the recording process. When Vicari heard the final playback, he understood that Warner Brothers' safety nets had never been necessary. Prince hadn't just met professional standards, he'd exceeded them. The teenager who demanded full creative control had delivered exactly what he'd promised. For You was released in April 1979. The music industry's response was immediate confusion. Critics didn't know how to categorize it. Radio programmers didn't know which format should play it. But everyone recognized that something significant had happened. The album credits, which usually listed dozens of session musicians and technical staff, contained primarily one name: Prince. Produced by Prince. All instruments performed by Prince. Arrangements by Prince. It was unprecedented, and it forced the industry to confront uncomfortable questions about their assumptions regarding age, experience, and creative capability. Warner Brothers' initial reservations transformed into vindication. They'd taken an enormous risk, granting production control to a teenager when every bit of industry wisdom said they should impose experienced guidance. That risk had produced an album that immediately established Prince as an artist unlike anyone else. The commercial performance was modest. The album reached number 163 on the Billboard charts, sold respectably, but not spectacularly. But commercial success had never been the real question. The question was whether Prince could deliver on his impossible promise, whether his confidence was justified, whether a 19-year-old could really produce a professional album without experienced supervision. The answer, undeniably, was yes. More importantly for Prince's future, the precedent was set. When negotiations began for his second album, there was no discussion about production control. Warner Brothers understood that trying to assign outside producers to Prince would be like trying to assign another painter to finish a Picasso. The music existed completely formed in Prince's mind, and his job wasn't to perform it, but to capture it exactly as he heard it. Over the next decade, this autonomy would allow Prince to create some of the most innovative music in pop history. Dirty Mind, 1999, Purple Rain, albums that couldn't have existed if Warner Brothers had forced him to work within traditional industry structures. What happened in that Burbank conference room eventually changed more than just Prince's career. After Prince proved that an artist could successfully produce their own major label debut, other musicians began demanding similar control. The rigid producer system that had dominated the industry for decades began to crack. Labels became more willing to trust artistic vision over institutional experience, to recognize that technical skill wasn't always a function of age or traditional credentials. Warner Brothers' willingness to grant Prince's impossible demand established them as a label that would support genuine artistry, even when it contradicted industry norms. That reputation would attract other innovative artists, would help build a roster known for creative risk-taking, rather than just commercial calculation. For Prince himself, the contract represented something deeper than career strategy. He'd grown up watching his father struggle as a musician, watching talent get ground down by practical necessities and compromised visions. When Prince demanded production control at 19, he wasn't just negotiating business terms. He was refusing to let that pattern repeat. He was drawing a line and declaring that he'd rather have no career than have a career built on someone else's terms. That morning in Burbank, when a teenager looked at a $3 million contract and saw it as incomplete, changed the conversation about what artists could demand and what labels should expect. The music that came from that decision, the albums Prince produced over the following decades, proved that sometimes the impossible request is exactly what's necessary. Sometimes the kid with no traditional experience really does know better than the executives with decades of success. Prince's insistence on producing himself wasn't a lucky gamble or youthful arrogance. It was a calculated stand based on absolute certainty about his own abilities. He'd spent years preparing for that moment, learning not just how to make music, but how to capture it, how to translate the sounds in his imagination into recordings that other people could experience. When he told Warner Brothers he could produce his own album, he wasn't hoping it was true or trying to convince himself. He knew it was true with the same certainty that he knew his own name. The conference room in Burbank where that conversation happened is probably gone now, remodeled or demolished, replaced by modern spaces that look nothing like they did in 1978. But what happened in that room still echoes through the music industry. Every time an artist negotiates for creative control, every time a label takes a chance on vision over formula, every time someone chooses integrity over compromise, they're walking through the door that Prince opened when he was 19 years old with platform shoes and a demo tape and an impossible demand that turned out to be completely reasonable. And the music that exists because of that decision, the innovations that became possible because one teenager refused to compromise, stands as proof that sometimes the greatest risk is refusing to take risks at all.